Hi everyone. It has been a little while since I have been on here to do this, but I think I have a pretty good reason. We welcomed our fourth child, Everett James, on September 15th. So he has been keeping us pretty busy since then, but it's been a real joy to have him and to watch his siblings enjoying him and things like that. I also am recording in a different location than I usually do, and that is because as I am doing this, the Michigan State game is taking place. And if you know anything about my husband, you know that he is a Michigan fan. And I am a Penn State fan, which I don't know if you can see, but I'm wearing my Penn State shirt. We have our big game tonight. By the time you guys are watching this, both of these games will have been played and will be over. But anyway, so he has taken over the rest of the house. I'm hoping that down here you won't actually hear his cheering, or he doesn't usually yell during games, but it's possible. So anyway, so I'm down here in a room in the downstairs of our house, kind of tucked away in the corner, hoping that this will go well. But anyway, like I said, we've been busy with just a lot going on this fall so far, but I'm actually about to return to school. My maternity leave has officially come to an end, and my dad, who I owe so much thanks to, because he stepped in for me in the classroom, and I know it was it's a lot to kind of jump in and have to, not, for anybody who's been a substitute teacher, it can be tough, but to have to jump in and do it for an extended period of time is even more challenging. So I'm extremely grateful, in addition to all of his responsibilities with the church, that he was able to take that on. But I think he's ready for a break, and I'm kind of ready to get back. So that's what's been going on, though, on our end, in our home, and with our family. And within this sermon series, we've been working through the first letter from Peter. And last week at our outdoor service, we were dodging the raindrops just a little bit, but my dad was able to preach on the beginning part of chapter 2, and I'm going to pick up right where he left off, and that's with verse 18. So 1 Peter 2, verses 18, and we're going to go the whole way to the end of the chapter, to 25. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the passage so that we at least hear it one time through, and then we'll break it down as we move through it a little bit. But if you have your Bibles and are wanting to read through with me, feel free. If not, just listen. In verse 18, it says, servants. Sorry, and in a lot of translations, it'll actually say slaves there. But servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed, for you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. So that's the whole passage that we're going to cover. And you'll find this passage is kind of tucked here in the midst of other passages, other kind of statements that Peter's making, where he's exhorting them, he's exhorting the hearers to be good citizens, which is what was talked about last week, to be good slaves in this instance, to be good wives and husbands, which is what's going to come later in the letter. And in each case, he's kind of calling them to let their actions let their actions serve as a testimony to the gospel message. Okay, so however they respond in various scenarios that are described along the way here, like in this case, it's this scenario of innocent suffering. It's basically saying he's calling them, he's exhorting them, he's encouraging them to respond in such a way that gives testimony to the gospel. And also among these passages is this assurance of like a future reward for this, an eternal, or just this promise of a later reward for these actions. So before we actually unpack these verses, we have to take a closer look at this issue of slavery at this time, and what this time period is often referred to as the Greco-Roman world, the Greco-Roman time period, and this term slavery. And again, I was reading out of the ESV, it actually said servant, but I know the majority of them will often say slave. And servant is actually probably more accurate though to what it is, which is like, I'm sure with the ESV, in choosing to use the word servant, it kind of links it more accurately to the actual practice that it's referring to. So let me just talk a little bit about that, because when we hear the word slavery, and it's not for, it's for very logical and understandable reasons, but when we hear the term slavery, it very much so links us to our experience with slavery in North America. And that it's important that we try not to do that, simply because they weren't the same. And in this time period, what's described as slavery in some, and what's described as like servants in other, this word bond servant, I'm sure you've heard that, but bond servant is actually probably the most accurate term here for what this kind of cultural practice, this societal norm, what it actually was. So I know we're relying heavily on these commentaries by N.T. Wright, and sometimes he just has a way of putting something that I don't even want to attempt to put it in my own words, because he does such a good job. And I love how he describes this idea of slavery, and I found for me it was really a helpful way of picturing it. So it's a little bit longer, but if you just want to sit back and listen, he says, "Not long ago, at the height of a snowstorm, our house and 2 nearby villages as well were without electric power for 14 hours. Our heating system is controlled by electricity, so the house became very cold. We could burn logs in a stove, but though that could keep us warm, it wouldn't be easy to cook on it. The telephones didn't work. The computers, of course, didn't work either. It reminded me once more not only what it's like for many people today in parts of the world where electric power is only intermittent, but what it is like for everyone until extremely recently within human history." So that first paragraph, he's just saying like they experienced a power outage and this is what it was like. Now he's kind of putting another layer on that. Now imagine as well that there was a fuel shortage, so that nobody could use their cars, no trains running either, no planes flying. Suddenly life is a lot more basic and a lot more time consuming. I doubt if I'd be sitting here writing a book if I lived in a world without electric power or motorized transport. I'd probably be out chopping wood or walking to the nearest town to pick up vegetables. And if I wanted to make the time to do anything more creative, I would have to find someone to do all those things for me. In a world of scarce resources, there might be plenty of people willing to work in return for their keep. In the ancient world, more or less everything that today is done by electricity, gas, and motorized engines was done by slaves. This is not, of course, in defense of the system of slavery." And then he goes on to talk about issues with it, which we're going to actually get to that later. But if you understand there what he was saying, he's basically depicting what the world was like: no electricity and no fuel and all the things, the ripple effect that something like that would happen. So in a world before all of those things, he was kind of explaining how the use of people to fulfill, to step in those ways, how that came into play. again, he's not writing in defense of it. He's just simply writing to explain it. But basically what this consisted of is a bondservant. Someone would work for money, and eventually the plan would be to earn enough money to buy their own freedom. Okay, so they would be property of somebody. That is true. They would be property of somebody, and they would work, and they would in turn they would pay for their own freedom eventually, and then they would be a freed man, freed woman. And the thing is, at this time, oftentimes people actually sold themselves into this form of servanthood, and they would sell themselves as a bondservant, and it would be a way, in some cases, for them to kind of get ahead in society at that point. So if you think about, like, I immediately started thinking about that story of Jacob, where he basically sold himself to his future father-in-law as a servant, if you remember the story, for 7 years. And the reason for that was to pay the bride price for who he wanted to marry, which was Rachel. He ended up marrying Leah and Rachel and working for more than 7 years. But that's another form of this. Now, that was way back in the Old Testament, and we're much further along here. But that idea of actually like selling yourself as a servant so that you can turn around and pay for your freedom or pay for something, it's kind of a strange thing to picture today, but it was actually very common and very normal. Many who would earn and buy their own freedom, they would remain with their masters after they were technically free, and their masters would go from being their master to what is then called their patron. And oftentimes there was actually a really good relationship there between those two. They found some inscriptions in different locations on different things, but they found inscriptions where the freed person would have actually adopted the name of their patron, their former master, and almost in a sense becoming part of their family, going from being like at one point their property to eventually becoming like a member of their family. Another thing to clarify is slavery as we think of it, what our cultural experience has been. That in the New Testament passages is very clearly described as sin. And there's a passage out of Timothy and another one out of 1 Timothy and another one in Revelation where it's described very clearly as it talks about enslavers as being sinful. So what we think of as kind of like the human trafficking slavery side of things, the New Testament's very, very explicit in that is sinful. And so that's not really what's being described here. And we just need to make sure we kind of separate those two in order to truly understand what Peter, what Peter's speaking to, who he's speaking to, and what the practice was that he was describing. Now, you might be thinking, okay, he's talking, before this, he's talking to citizens. After this, he's going to be talking to wives and husbands and kind of calling them to certain behaviors or actions. But then the question, excuse me, kind of like, well, why slaves? Like, where do slaves fit in the picture? Was that really, citizens, huge, broad category. Excuse me, husbands and wives, also very broad categories. You would think slaves would be a pretty small category. But in fact, there were quite a few Christian slaves. And part of the reason for that is if you think about the gospel message was incredibly appealing to those who were among the servants or just generally in kind of the social lower class. If you think about the gospel message, the message of dignity and self-worth and kind of all those upside down kingdom messages, the first shall be last, last shall be first, and like our earthly riches, standing in the way. All those things, you can see why it would be a very appealing message to those who are in that lower class. And so there were quite a few Christian slaves, which is why, Peter would have felt compelled to speak to them specifically. So now I described for you what this idea of like being a bondservant was and what, slavery in the New Testament days looked like. But this is not to pretend or to say that slavery in the Greco-Roman period was a great thing. I'm not saying it was a great thing. I was just trying to say that it was a different thing than what we often think of. But it wasn't a great thing. Obviously, there's a devaluing of human life that's taking place here. And that in and of itself, whether you have a good master or a bad master, you still have that taking place, that one person is serving as someone else's property. And that's a problem, right? I mean, that no matter what is an issue. And the other thing is, there were obvious abuses that took place within this framework. A framework like this, you can see how it would just so easily lead to abuses. And it did. If it didn't, Peter would never have felt the need to say what he then says in here. So I just want to make sure that it's clear that I'm not saying, oh, it was like this great thing that existed in their culture. It obviously was not, but it was definitely a different thing than what we think of. So what we're getting at here is this issue of innocent suffering. And we'll come back to that more and more. Or just unjust. When you face, unjustness, or you face unfairness, when you suffer in a way that is not deserved. And I was pulling this together, and I was thinking like, oh, I wish I kind of had some sort of story to go along with this. And this morning I was back in our room, and Asher came back, and he was obviously crying, and I hope he doesn't mind if I tell this story, but he had been crying, and he held his finger up, and he said that Easton had bit his finger. And he showed me, and there was like he had almost broken the skin, but he had like dented into the skin really hard. I mean, Easton has bitten my finger when I like put food at times in his mouth, and I don't get my fingers out in time, and that hurts. And that's when he's unintentionally doing it. But when he's angry and he's looking to, it hurts. So I felt for Asher in that moment. I knew that was very painful. So I went and I had a conversation with Easton, and Aaron had already had one, so we're hoping he'll eventually learn. But anyway, what was interesting is a little bit later, Asher was sitting there on the couch, and he said, how come Easton and Anna both can bite, but I can never bite them back? I kind of chuckled, and then he's like, it makes me so mad. And he's like, why can't I ever bite them back? And in a fair scenario, I mean, yeah, right? It'd be like, sure, he bites you, you bite his finger. Now, I know there's kids who are listening to this. I'm not suggesting you do that. And when Asher said that, I said, Asher, you know better. It's a different, you're 8, he's 2. I said, he doesn't fully understand yet. And I said, you definitely know better. We were talking like that. But this idea, like, there's something that's unfair in a way about that. And, kids are very quick to identify when things are unfair. I get it. And actually, we adults are too. We maybe just do it a little differently. But human nature, we see something unfair, and we want to level the playing field, right? We want to make it even. We want to make it equal. We want to make it fair. It's hard to handle it when it's not. Now, that's kind of a small, trivial thing. I mean, it wasn't trivial to Asher at the moment. But, when we go from this idea of unfairness to unjustness, that almost takes it, I think that takes it, deeper and more, gut-wrenching. And that's kind of what's being described here. This idea in the first couple passages where it says, and actually I'm going to read it from this, from N.T. Wright's own translation, when he says, let slaves obey their masters with all respect, not only the good and kind ones, but also the unkind ones. It is to your credit, you see, if because of godly conscience you put up with the unjust and painful suffering. And then he goes on, after all, what credit is it if you do something wrong and are beaten for it, and you take that patiently? But if you do what is right, and you suffer for it, and you bear that suffering patiently, that is to your credit before God. Now, that's not easy, right? I think we all would quickly say that's not easy, and that's not fair. And in this case, to this population of slaves, they would know that because they would have been on the receiving end. Many of them probably would have been on the receiving end of beatings, of physical beatings. And perhaps there were times when it was deserving, not that you ever want to excuse that to begin with, but there were plenty of times where it most certainly would not have been, and that there would have been no reason or cause for it. And even a slave may have been doing what was right, and as a result got beat for it. And that's just, that is a tough pill to swallow, right? And that sounds so trivial to say that, and so I feel like I shouldn't even put it that way. But one thing I want to clarify here is that, Peter's not telling the people not to speak up in the face of abuses and unjust behavior. He's not ordering them to be passive. The Bible has a very clear call to justice. And so that's not where Peter's going with this. He's not telling them to be silent in the face of unjustness. There's something deeper that he's reaching for here, and there's a deeper truth that he's touching on, which we'll see here. And in order to do that, we're going to break down the passage a little bit more, or at least the second part of it. So that's the scenario. The scenario that he's basing this on is to the slaves, to the servants, when they endure unfair treatment, unfair beatings, or innocent suffering. We'll probably use that term, innocent suffering, for most of the rest of what we'll talk about. He was saying it's to your credit, right? It's to your credit. Now, if something is to our credit, like if you get store credit, that means you have a future reward, right? If you have store credit, you can take that credit back to the store, you can cash it in, and you can get something. So to say that this is to your credit, it alludes to this idea of a future reward for this behavior, right? They may not know it now, they may not experience it now, but they will essentially be credited in God's eyes for making those choices and reacting or responding in the way that they're being called to here. And there's this promise of a future reward for these types of decisions. So the first few verses, they establish that call to endure this unjust suffering. And then the remaining verses explain why. Why do we have to do that? Why shouldn't we just rise up at every, moment of innocent suffering? And to quote again from Wright, he describes verses 21 to 25. He says this is one of the clearest statements in all of the New Testament of how Christ took on himself the punishment that his people deserved. He was the only one who could completely and fully stand in for them, undeserving of the punishment. And basically what happens in 21 through 25 is Peter says, we do this, the first couple verses, we endure this unjust suffering, these moments of innocent suffering. We endure this because we're following Christ's example. And those verses then talk about how Jesus was kind of the ultimate picture of innocent suffering. And I think we all know and understand that. He was sinless. He stood in for our sin, and he atoned for it. And Peter very powerfully links his description of Jesus' suffering to Old Testament passages, specifically out of Isaiah. Isaiah 52 and 53. There's in Isaiah, there are what's called the servant songs, and you've probably heard of them. But the fourth one in particular is what he links to here. And you've probably heard this phrase, the suffering servant. What you have here is you have these Old Testament messianic prophecies about this coming Messiah, but this Messiah would be in the form of a servant who suffers. And not only who suffers, but suffers innocently. And so a lot of the phrases that appear in these verses, like how, it says how Jesus committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. It talks about how he was reviled and he did not revile in return, how he bore our sins. Those phrases are very, very closely linked to these passages, specifically in chapter 52 and 53 of Isaiah, in that fourth servant song. And it would have been, for the people receiving this letter, the people hearing Peter's words, they would have they would have recognized that link. Like that would have been a very, that would have immediately connected them to these Isaiah prophecies. And so that would have had a very, very powerful connection for them. And then, the 21 through 25, it's describing Christ's innocent suffering, how he's the ultimate example of that. And then it finishes with a reminder that he did this so that, he did this for us. He did this so that we would be healed, that we would be rescued from sin. And then the last verse, for you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and the overseer of our souls because of this innocent suffering. Now, this all kind of makes sense in a way. We know that Jesus did that. We know that his suffering atoned for our sin. And this call to endure suffering, to follow his example, sure, that makes sense. Okay. I can understand why, Peter would encourage us to do that. But I think there's a little bit more to it than just what we maybe initially interpret from this passage. This does more than just remind us of what Jesus did for us. And not that that's not significant enough on its own. I mean, that alone could be it, the end of this message. But I think there's a one step further that we can go with that. So by choosing to endure suffering, we are following his example. By choosing to endure innocent suffering, we are following his example, one who suffered more innocently than anyone ever has, right? But we're being connected in a very powerful way to his life, his message, and his story. Now, as I move into the application here, can I truly say that I have faced innocent suffering as described in this passage? I don't really think I can. Obviously, I have not faced the suffering to the degree of Christ. I have not faced suffering to the degree of these slaves who have faced, unjust beatings at the hands of their masters. Any innocent suffering that I look back on my life and I think, okay, well, maybe that would fall into that category. I mean, it seems so ridiculous by comparison. And I'm sure for some of you that's the case. For others of you that may not be the case. And there are Christians around the world whose suffering is a little bit more on par with what we're reading about in this passage. So there is a part, I just feel like I need to say that, and this idea that I don't know how much innocent suffering I have really faced. And but I think we've all felt unfairness, and we've been on the receiving end of unjust treatment in whatever way, shape, or form that takes. And we know the feelings created by those experiences, and they tend to stay with us, right? If you encounter a situation where there is a sense of unjustness or unfairness, I mean, that gets to you, right? Even if you're not the one receiving it and you just observe it in someone else's life or someone else's experiences, that is really, really hard. That is really hard to not reach into that situation and make things right. I feel this a lot. When I just want to reach into situations and just make things right and figure out the way to make things balanced, to make things fair, to make things the way they ought to be. And the situations and experiences where you can't do that, either, whether it's a time you feel like your mouth, like you're muzzled. I've often used that expression, like you feel like you're muzzled. And meaning your words don't carry any weight, or your words will fall on deaf ears, whatever it might be. Or where you physically cannot, reach in and remedy these situations. I mean, those are infuriating. I mean, infuriating isn't even a strong enough word. I don't even know what the word would be that's strong enough to capture the feeling that those experiences can create. And it's not a one-time thing. It's not like a fleeting feeling that is here today, gone tomorrow, and you're just at peace with it. Some people manage to release those feelings and have peace in those situations. And I have incredible respect for those who are able to do that, sometimes more readily than others. But because those feelings have a way of just kind of, they just sit and they get in there, and they're so hard to release those feelings that they create. So I think we all can probably understand that, even though we may look back on our lives and say, well, goodness, I haven't been, I don't face what these slaves have faced, and I certainly have not suffered like Christ. But I do think we know those feelings that are created by innocent suffering. So Peter's inviting the audience to embrace Jesus' story as their own. He's telling them, embrace Christ's story as our own. Be healed by it, be rescued by it, first and foremost. Pattern our lives after Jesus' example. But it's not just about our own rescue. And this is what I really appreciated about some of the commentaries that I was reading. They were describing that as Christ suffers, as his suffering is extended through our lives, okay, through the life of his people, both in Peter's day and today. So as Jesus' suffering is extended into our lives, the world itself may be brought to a new place. In other words, the world itself may be changed by it. I mean, look at how the world has been changed by Christ's suffering. And as his suffering goes out into, and it's not to say like, oh, let's all just go suffer, woohoo, right? I mean, that's not a real encouraging message. But when we do face suffering, as we look to Christ's example, and as we choose to walk through those experiences as best we can by the grace of God and follow his example, the world will be impacted by that. Most immediately, those around us. And I can speak for myself. When I have seen people in my life face suffering and seen them kind of handle it in how it's being described here, that changes people. That speaks volumes to people. It's a very impactful thing to see when somebody endures innocent suffering, unjust treatment. It's very impactful. Another quote that I really appreciated when I read it says, "We must see all the unjust suffering of God's people as caught up within the suffering of his Son." I want to finish with a few things here. It's always a struggle, I think, when we try to understand and explain suffering in general. I don't think you have to look too far past the book of Job to really display what I mean there. You have Job's friends trying to explain away what's going on, and you have Job wrestling with what he feels is this innocent suffering. So I'm not going to try and explain or fully understand suffering, because first of all, I don't think it's possible, and second of all, I don't think that's the point here. But rather, I found some encouragement in this passage, and there's really three things that I want to turn around and encourage you with. This passage reminds us of a couple things. One, there is a promise of a later and eternal reward. And I know that's not always, what's the word? I know sometimes, I often think of my kids, I can promise them, hey, I'll give you candy this evening. And, if you do this now. And it doesn't always cut it because they want the reward now, right? Hopefully we are willing to still be encouraged by future hope, a future reward, when sometimes in the moment it might be hard. But that's the first thing. So there's this promise of a later eternal reward. The second thing is, just a reminder that to walk this out, what Peter's describing, it links us in a profound way to Christ's suffering. And that should be encouraging, that we even have the opportunity to join him in his suffering. and to participate in that. And the third thing connects to that. By doing so, we get to participate in God's upper story. And I know we've used lower story before, but we get to participate in God's upper story. And it's a way in which our lower story lives are swept up into God's upper story. And that's really exciting. This idea that, these little lives that we are living here on this earth in this specific time and place can be swept up into God's overarching, massive story that is unfolding. And for this time and place, our lives can be a part of that upper story. And one of the most powerful ways that happens is through this suffering that we face, and specifically in this case, the innocent suffering, the unjust suffering, and the choices that we make in the face of that. We never know the impact of those around us and the world around us when we choose to follow his example, in particular in this specific way. That's what I have for today. That's what this passage was saying to me and what I wanted to pass along to you. I'm going to end with, I'm actually going to use the kind of the benediction that Peter uses in this passage. It's a little long, and I'm sure at some point my dad or Matt will actually be preaching on this part, but I'll go ahead and just read it now. He says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same kinds of suffering are being experienced by your brotherhood throughout the world. And after you have suffered a little while, the God of all grace, who has called you to his eternal glory in Christ, will himself restore, confirm, strengthen, and establish you. To him be the dominion forever and ever. Amen."